An elderly black veteran sits quietly on a park bench until a white officer slams him to the ground in broad daylight. But what that officer didn't know, cameras were rolling. Witnesses were watching. And this wasn't an accident. It was the start of a carefully planned trap that would shake an entire city. You think you've seen stories of injustice before, you haven't seen this. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It started with a flag. Not a siren, not a protest, not a call for justice. Just a small American flag trembling gently in the grip of an old man's hand. Major Henry Lawson stood alone beneath the heavy gray sky of Harlem's Riverside Park, his breath catching in the cold November air. He wore a threadbare military coat that had once been crisp with ceremony. The patches were faded, the buttons dulled, but the weight of what it meant was unmistakable. His limp was more pronounced this morning. But he didn't complain. He never did. He came every Veterans Day like clockwork to honor the men who hadn't come home. But this year, something was different. It was the silence. Not the respectful kind. Not the kind that falls over a crowd when a trumpet plays taps or when a widow lays a hand on a grave. This silence was thicker coiled, watching. Henry didn't know that across the park, Officer Kyle Brennan had already spotted him, had already decided he didn't belong. Brennan was new to Harlem, transferred quietly from another precinct upstate after a series of miscommunications that never made the evening news. He walked with a chip on his shoulder and a chip in his heart, convinced the world owed him something and that anyone who didn't look like him was a potential threat. And today, he saw Henry Lawson, a lone elderly black man near a war memorial, pull something from his coat. Brennan's hand went straight to his radio. Possible suspicious activity, he muttered low enough not to raise alarm, but firm enough to make it real. Black male, elderly, possibly armed. Near the Korean War monument. Possibly armed. What Henry had pulled from his coat was a plastic sandwich bag. Inside it, 3 tarnished medals and a folded-up photograph. Men in fatigues, dust and sweat. Brothers. He knelt by the base of the monument, pressing the photo gently to the cold stone. Then came the footsteps, heavy boots, rushed breath, the metallic clink of a sidearm holster. "Sir, stand up now. Keep your hands where I can see them." Henry didn't flinch. Not at first. He'd heard that voice before. Not Brennan's exactly, but versions of it. In Alabama, in Mississippi, in South Korea. A voice that didn't ask. A voice that assumed. "I'm a veteran," Henry said, calmly, looking up with steady eyes. "I'm just here to honor some friends." Brennan didn't care. He was already in motion, barking into his shoulder mic, hand twitching near his weapon. "Put it down," he shouted, pointing at the flag, the medals, the photo, everything that made Henry human, suddenly twisted into something threatening. A jogger stopped, then another. 2 children, holding their mother's hand, watched as Brennan grabbed Henry's arm. "You!" Resisting, he hissed, tightening his grip. "I'm standing," Henry replied, steady as stone. And then, without warning, Brennan shoved him. Hard. Henry's head struck the corner of the stone monument with a sickening crack. Blood ran into his collar. He didn't cry out. He just closed his eyes and whispered something so softly no one could hear. Not yet. Across the park, a figure stirred. Ariel Johnson had been filming interviews for a documentary on Black veterans. She'd seen the whole thing, camera still rolling. She ran heart-pounding, not sure if she was witnessing history or the end of it. A voice shouted from behind a tree. Officer Brennan, step away from him. Another figure emerged, Detective Raymond Velez, plainclothes badge clipped to his belt. Brennan turned, startled. "This is a police matter. Who the hell are you?" Velez didn't answer. He knelt beside Henry instead, gently lifting his head, whispering something we couldn't hear. Henry opened his eyes, nodded once, and then the cameras, the joggers, the bystanders, phones out, voices raised. Brennan backed up, realizing too late that the moment was no longer his to control. Henry sat up slowly, his voice hoarse but alive. "I've fought in 2 wars," he said to no one in particular, "but I've never been treated like an enemy until I came back home." That sentence, 16 words, would burn across the internet before sundown. The incident would make national headlines by nightfall. But none of the headlines would capture the stillness of that moment, the shattered quiet of a man who had carried his country on his back only to be thrown to the ground by its fear. That was the hook. But it wasn't the story. Not yet. Because what no one knew, what Brennan couldn't have imagined, was that this wasn't random. This wasn't just a tragic misunderstanding or a single cop's mistake. It was a trap. Ariel had been documenting misconduct for months. Velez had been tracking Brennan since upstate. And Henry Lawson, he'd agreed to be part of it all. He knew the risk. He knew what he represented. And he knew maybe better than anyone that sometimes the only way to expose a sickness is to make it bleed in the daylight. So when Brennan struck him, he didn't just hit a man. He detonated the truth. And the city of New York. It would never be the same. It didn't take long for the footage to travel. By noon, the video of Officer Brennan throwing 78-year-old veteran Henry Lawson to the ground had already been viewed over 500,000 times. By evening, it had crossed 1 million. The images, grainy yet undeniable, showed everything: Brennan's aggressive approach, the disregard in his voice, the shove, the sickening thud as Henry's head struck the stone. But what no one could see in those seconds was the years of planning that had led to that exact moment. Because Henry wasn't alone. He never had been. From apartment windows, coffee shops, parked cars, and community centers, people had been watching Brennan for months. They called themselves the Watchers. Most were unknown to each other, operating in isolation to protect the integrity of their mission. But at the center of the web stood Ariel Johnson and Detective Raymond Velez, 2 people whose paths had diverged long ago, but found convergence in their shared sense of purpose. Ariel had first picked up a camera to preserve stories that were slipping away. Her own grandfather, a Tuskegee airman, had died before she ever got to ask him how he endured fighting for a country that barely acknowledged his humanity. She vowed never to let another legacy disappear in silence. That vow had brought her to Riverside Park and to Henry, whose quiet dignity made him the perfect symbol. But more than that, the perfect teacher. Velez, on the other hand, was driven by disillusionment. A Puerto Rican detective who had spent 2 decades in the NYPD, he'd watched good cops burn out and bad ones get promoted. He'd tried to fix things from the inside. tried to report misconduct, tried to believe. But after being sidelined one too many times, he stopped filing reports and started building a case. Quietly, deliberately, one cop at a time. Brennan wasn't the first on his list, but he was the most dangerous. Transferred from a department with a sealed misconduct record, Brennan had slipped through the cracks, thanks to a recommendation and a favor owed between brass. What Velez had found in his personnel files with Ariel's help was damning falsified reports, excessive force complaints that vanished without a trace, traffic stops that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino men. But Velez knew better than to bring it forward without undeniable evidence. Internal affairs would bury it. The press would spin it. So he waited and watched. And then Henry volunteered. It wasn't easy convincing the retired major to put himself in harm's way. But when Velez explained the stakes, that it wasn't just about Brennan, but the system that enabled him, Henry didn't hesitate. "I've faced worse in countries that didn't even speak my language," he said. "At least this time, I know why I'm marching." Still watching him fall had shaken them both. Even Ariel, who had braced for the worst, felt her hands trembling long after she'd stopped recording. There was something primal about seeing a man like Henry struck down, not because he was fragile, but because he was noble. And watching him hurt reopened every generational wound that Black America had carried silently for decades. By nightfall, the watchers began stepping out of the shadows. A former librarian named Denise posted her own footage taken from across the park from the moment Brennan approached. A high school teacher who'd been walking his dog uploaded another angle showing Brennan ignoring bystanders who pleaded with him to stop. Even a street vendor who didn't speak much English contributed a blurry clip from his security camera that captured Brennan's radio call. Possible suspect, maybe armed unknown intentions. Each clip added weight. And together, they built a case that could not be ignored. The NYPD tried to respond quickly. A spokesperson stood stiffly at a podium, reading from a statement. "We are conducting a full review of Officer Brennan's conduct and taking this matter very seriously." But the public had heard those words before. Too many times. They didn't want a review. They wanted justice. Inside a brownstone, just a few blocks from the park, Ariel and Velez met with members of the Watchers that evening for the first time in person. The living room was crowded with voices, old, young, seasoned activists, and first-time witnesses. They spoke with urgency, fueled not just by what had happened to Henry, but by a collective exhaustion that had been building for years. "This is our moment," Denise said, her voice rising. "We don't just want him suspended. We want transparency. We want the hiring records, the misconduct files, the names. We need to take this city to court," added another, a law student who'd been gathering signatures since the video went viral. "Class action, systemic profiling." This is more than one man. Velez knotted arms folded across his chest. He had waited years for this convergence, this perfect storm of testimony footage, data, and public momentum. But he knew it was fragile. "They'll try to break us apart," he warned. "They'll say it was isolated, that Brennan snapped. They'll offer him up as a scapegoat and protect everyone else behind him." Ariel stepped forward then. Her eyes shone, not with anger, but purpose. "Then we make it bigger than Brennan," she said. "We show them what it looks like when a city watches back." And in that room, for the first time in a long time, the people didn't feel powerless. They felt ready. What none of them knew yet, what not even Velez had uncovered, was that someone else had been watching too. Someone with access, someone inside, someone tired of pretending they didn't see what they saw. And they were about to send Ariel an email that would crack everything wide open. A file, a name, a warning, and the proof that Brennan wasn't a lone wolf. He was part of a pack. At 3:12 a.m., Ariel Johnson's inbox pinged with an anonymous message that would change everything. No subject, no signature, just a file labeled Internal Access Sept. Inside were PDFs, scanned images, and a brief message. They'll say it's just Brennan. It's not. Start with Sergeant Millhouse. Follow the complaint trails. You'll find them stacked like bones. Ariel didn't sleep after that. By sunrise, she and Detective Raymond Velez sat hunched over a table at a 24-hour diner in Harlem, sifting through pages that should never have left the precinct's server. What they uncovered was not a record of isolated misconduct. It was a pattern chilling in its precision. Brennan was merely a spoke in a far larger wheel. Sergeant Millhouse, a supervisory officer at the 17th Precinct, had quietly rerouted dozens of citizen complaints. Language like unfounded insufficient evidence and resolved internally filled the forms like wallpaper. But behind each was a name, a voice, a silenced truth. And now they had receipts. Velez, never one to jump too quickly, reviewed the chain of signatures. You see this? These aren't just rubber stamps. This was coordinated. They protected each other. Passed these complaints up and around until they vanished. Ariel stared down at the forms. The names were painfully familiar, mostly Black and Latino residents of the South Bronx, East Harlem, and Queensbridge. She'd interviewed many of them before, men and women who had spoken of threats, stops and searches with such routine fatigue that they had almost stopped fighting. Now suddenly, they had a weapon. The next move was delicate. They couldn't release everything publicly, not yet. If the documents got traced back to their source too soon, the whistleblower might disappear, or worse. So they made a plan. Velez would contact a federal liaison he trusted from his years in narcotics, someone who owed him a favor and wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers. Ariel would begin verifying the stories one by one, getting video statements, witness accounts corroboration. They needed airtight credibility because they both knew how this worked. The system didn't fall from truth alone. It resisted, it twisted it, tried to absorb the blow and keep standing. You had to strike not just with force, but with timing. And their timing, finally, was starting to align. That Monday, Brennan was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department's press release was riddled with passive phrasing incident under review officer's conduct being evaluated. But the community wasn't fooled. Protesters gathered outside the 17th Precinct with signs that read, "Not just Brennan, follow the trail." Who's protecting the protectors? Elena Rivera, a local councilwoman with a background in civil rights law, stood in front of the crowd with a bullhorn. Her voice didn't shake. "We're not asking for apologies," she said. "We're demanding accountability. And we have the proof." The crowd erupted. News outlets took notice. The mayor's office, caught between political liability and growing public fury, scheduled an emergency oversight hearing. Ariel and Velez were both asked to testify, Ariel as a community journalist, Velez as a former NYPD detective. Neither hesitated, but the system didn't roll over. At the hearing, the mood inside City Hall was electric hope and tension coiling like wires beneath every word. Ariel walked slowly to the podium, looked out at the mix of skeptical politicians, fidgeting officers, and silent observers and began. "I didn't come here to accuse one man," she said. "I came to expose a culture." She laid it out, the video of Brennan, the sealed misconduct records, the anonymous file, the complaints erased like chalk in rain. Velez followed with hard numbers, citing suppression tactics, reassignments used to bury accusations, the internal transfers designed to protect problematic officers under the guise of admin moves. The hearing stretched for hours. Sweat beaded under collars. One official asked if the documents were stolen. "They were leaked," Velez said calmly, "by someone inside who finally had enough." The city council promised to launch an internal review committee, but review wasn't enough. Outside City Hall, the movement had grown teeth. Community organizers coordinated nightly gatherings while pro bono legal teams began prepping a class action suit. The Watchers expanded now, holding open training sessions for residents, teaching them how to safely record police encounters, how to request body cam footage, how to file formal complaints, and follow up when they disappeared. Elena Rivera's office became an unofficial command center. Volunteers lined the hallway. Piles of affidavits grew by the hour, but then came the blowback. Ariel's apartment was broken into, her equipment untouched, but her files, scattered papers missing. A message scrawled across her whiteboard, in permanent marker, "Not your fight." Velez received a call from a blocked number. A man's voice, low controlled, "You think you're helping, but you're waking a beast that doesn't forget faces." Neither backed down. Instead, they went louder. Ariel aired a new expose through her digital news platform, Seen and Heard, featuring first-hand testimonies from residents who had once been silenced. Names, faces, tears, and dignity. The segment went viral, shared by celebrities, amplified by national civil rights groups. Suddenly, it wasn't just a New York issue. It was national. The Justice Department quietly reached out. Meanwhile, back in the Bronx, Henry Lawson recovered in a rehab facility, bruised but unbowed. Ariel visited him, with a tablet in hand, showing him the news, the hearing clips, the protests. He smiled faintly. "They never saw us coming," he whispered, "but they'll see us now." And yet the system didn't break. Not yet. It stalled, delayed offered token reforms. Brennan remained under investigation, but no charges were filed. Sergeant Milhouse was quietly reassigned to desk duty. The Oversight Committee delayed its first meeting, citing logistical challenges, a familiar playbook. But this time, the people weren't reading from that script. Because the system could stall and bend, but they weren't going to let it breathe. Not this time. Not with so much truth now out in the open. And not while Henry was still alive to see what happened next. It wasn't enough to expose what was broken. Not anymore. Ariel Johnson, Detective Velez, and Councilwoman Elena Rivera knew the city had seen too many promises that dissolved under pressure, too many investigations that led nowhere. The time for headlines was over. It was time to set a trap meticulously, legally, and undeniably. They couldn't wait for the system to fix itself. So they created a parallel one built on shadows, truths, and precision. Ariel called it the mirror play. If the old system used silence and power to shield itself, they would use visibility and patience to dismantle it piece by piece. The goal wasn't just to expose more injustice. It was to make the system incriminate itself. Step one was getting someone inside. The Watchers, now numbering in the hundreds across the city, had quietly recruited a young patrol officer named Malik Jefferson. Smart, careful, and with roots in the community, Malik had joined the force to protect his neighborhood, but found himself quickly sidelined when he refused to conform to the culture of indifference. He'd come to Elena's office 3 weeks after Brennan assaulted Henry Lawson, his voice low but resolute. "I'm done playing along," he said. "Tell me what you need." They needed eyes, ears, proof. Malik started documenting everything. Roll call meetings where supervisors warned officers to stay sharp in high minority areas. Text threads between precinct sergeants using coded language. Clean sweeps, light taps, quiet hands. Body cam footage edited before being archived. Reports that were rewritten to erase aggressive tactics. He sent them all encrypted and time-stamped. But the trap needed bait. And for that, they turned to an unlikely source, Henry. When Ariel visited Henry again in the rehab center, she expected reluctance. He was recovering slowly, the bruises fading, but his spirit still wary. But when she explained the plan, he didn't hesitate. "I've lived my life surviving. Maybe it's time I do more than that." The setup was deceptively simple. Henry would return to Central Plaza, the same park where he had been assaulted, and take his usual seat on the same worn bench beneath the elm tree. Word would quietly spread through back channels just enough to ensure the wrong people knew he was there again. Meanwhile, Malik would be nearby, wearing his department-issued body cam and a hidden secondary recorder stitched into his jacket. The watchers would be positioned discreetly throughout the park, some with phones, others with long-lens cameras. Elena had arranged for a federal observer from the DOJ, disguised as a jogger, to be stationed by the fountains. They weren't hoping something would happen. They were counting on it. Because they knew the system didn't change when confronted with facts, it reacted when it felt threatened. And nothing threatened it more than a man like Henry refusing to disappear. It took less than 40 minutes. A cruiser rolled up to the far edge of the park near the basketball courts. Out stepped Sergeant Milhouse, the man whose name had quietly disappeared from the oversight hearing agenda the week before. Ariel watched from her bench phone, poised heart-pounding. Velez stood just yards away, disguised in a City Parks Department uniform. Malik, leaning near a lamppost, clicked on his second recorder. Milhouse moved with deliberate confidence, one hand resting on his belt, eyes scanning until they locked on Henry. His approach was slow, theatrical. Morning Milhouse said, his voice oily with fake warmth. Henry didn't flinch. "Afternoon," he replied. "What brings you back out here?" Milhouse asked, stepping closer. "Already violating Henry's space?" "I think I've got the same right as anyone to enjoy a park bench," Henry said, voice steady. Milhouse's smile vanished. "Still got some attitude, I see." Then came the moment they had prepared for. Milhouse reached down and grabbed Henry's satchel. "What's in the bag?" Henry placed his hand gently over the satchel. "My things. You have no right." Milhouse yanked the bag free and dumped its contents on the ground. Books, medication, a folder of documents, a few letters from Ariel. It was enough. Cameras clicked, phones recorded. Malik took a step forward, visibly alarmed, his voice loud and clear. "Sarge, he's not resisting. You can't search his property without cause." Milhouse turned sharply. "Stay out of this, Jefferson." "He has rights," Malik said, voice louder now. "And I've got everything on cam." Milhouse's face paled. The DOJ observer approached calmly, joggers slowing behind him. "Sergeant Milhouse," the man said, holding up a federal badge. "I'm going to ask you to step back from this individual immediately." Milhouse froze. The silence that followed was a vacuum sharp and absolute. Within seconds, more figures emerged from the background. Velez pulled off his park cap and revealed his badge. Elena Rivera arrived with two federal agents in tow. Ariel walked forward, broadcasting live to over 200,000 viewers. It was no longer a trap. It was a public reckoning. Milhouse was escorted away without incident, but not before trying to mutter about miscommunication and concerns for public safety. No one believed him. Not anymore. Mullick handed over his footage directly to the federal agents. The DOJ observer gave a quiet nod. We've got enough. And for the first time in weeks, Ariel exhaled. Back at the station, Internal Affairs didn't even wait for the mayor's office. Milhouse was suspended that evening. The footage was released publicly the next day. But more importantly, the city saw it unfold in real time. They saw what it looked like when power was challenged, not with chaos, but with strategy, unity, and law. The trap had been set, and the system walked right into it. Henry watched the coverage that night from his hospital bed, surrounded by reporters, friends, and strangers, who now called him a hero. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just stayed where I belonged. He looked up at Ariel, who stood quietly in the corner. But you all gave me the chance to finally matter out loud. And in that moment, she realized the trap hadn't just caught a man. It had caught a legacy. One they could finally rebuild from. The city didn't change overnight. No one expected it to. But something irreversible had shifted. It hummed in the early morning air, lingered in the conversations whispered between neighbors, and echoed down the streets where silence used to live. The trap had worked. The system had been forced to look at itself not in a mirror of convenient truths, but in a window cracked wide open by Henry Lawson, Ariel Johnson, Malik Jefferson, Elena Rivera, and hundreds more who refused to be unseen. In the days that followed, a momentum slow but certain began to build. Federal prosecutors announced further investigations into the upper echelons of the police force. Several high-ranking officers resigned before their records could be subpoenaed. Community members who once only watched from the sidelines now stepped forward. Churches opened their doors for forums. College students launched grassroots campaigns. Local business owners donated to a new fund created to support victims of profiling and unjust policing. But for Ariel, it wasn't the headlines that struck her. It was the quiet ones, the elderly woman who left a letter outside her office with only 3 words, "I saw everything." The teenager who showed up with a sketch of Henry sitting tall on that bench. The rookie officer who walked into her campaign office after shift, saying only, "Teach me." There was still so much to do. Policy proposals, training reforms, court testimonies. The mountain loomed still tall. But for the first time, they were climbing it together. 1 week after the arrest of Sergeant Milhouse, the city held a march, not a protest, not a rally, but something quieter. A dawn procession through the central plaza, tracing the path Henry had walked on that morning. That changed everything. No slogans, no megaphones, just footsteps, just presence. Henry was there, of course, seated in a wheelchair, but refusing help. Malik walked beside him, hands in his pockets, not in uniform, but wearing his department-issued badge on a lanyard clearly visible. Elena held a candle, her fingers trembling, not with fear, but with pride. Velez walked further back, blending into the crowd, watching, guarding. And Ariel. She didn't lead. She walked in the middle, among the people, listening, They walked as the first rays of sunlight crept across the city's rooftops, through neighborhoods that once braced themselves when cruisers rolled by, past storefronts whose owners now stood outside, hands over hearts, through streets where justice had too long been a visitor, never a resident. When they reached the plaza, no one spoke for a long time. The crowd gathered quietly around the bench where it had all started. The city had placed a plaque there now, just one line. This bench belongs to everyone. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was honest. Henry looked out over the crowd, then turned to Ariel. You think they'll remember? She nodded. Only if we keep reminding them. A soft breeze moved through the plaza. Someone started humming an old gospel tune, slow, low, mournful, and strong. Others joined in, not loud, just present. Feet tapped gently. Shoulders swayed. No one led the song. It belonged to everyone. Ariel felt something rise in her chest, not triumph, not even relief. It was something steadier, a kind of peace that only comes from knowing you stood up, even when you didn't know what would happen next. The sun crested over the buildings, spilling light onto the stone, the bench, the faces of everyone gathered. The night had passed. And while the work remained, while the healing was far from done, the city had taken a step. A real step. A march toward the morning, and they weren't turning back. In the heart of Minneapolis, where silence had once stood as a veil for injustice, a simple morning walk by an elderly black man uncovered a city's most uncomfortable truths. Henry Lawson wasn't looking for trouble. He was seeking nothing more than peace. A seat on a public bench and a few sips of coffee to begin his day. But that moment became a lightning rod for everything buried beneath the surface: unchecked authority, ingrained prejudice, and a broken system hiding behind protocol. What began as a routine act of racial profiling by Sergeant Milhouse spiraled into something he never anticipated. Because Henry wasn't alone. Behind his quiet strength stood Ariel Johnson, a civil rights attorney and community advocate whose passion was forged from the pain of her own family's history. Then came Malik Jefferson, a young police officer torn between the badge he wore and the truth he could no longer ignore. Elena Rivera, a local news producer who decided to tell the story her newsroom didn't want aired. And even Agent Velez, who emerged from the shadows, not as a savior, but as someone who had seen too much and could stay silent no longer. Together, they created a spark. Not by force, but through strategy. Not by shouting over the noise, but by forcing the silence to break. They planned. They documented. They exposed. And when the truth came out, it wasn't just Milhouse who was held accountable. It was an entire culture of complicity that had to answer for itself. The city of Minneapolis didn't become perfect overnight, but it bent. And in bending, it began to heal. Henry, though, scarred, remained dignified. He did not seek revenge. He sought respect. He demanded that future generations be treated with the dignity he'd been denied too many times in his life. Ariel, now a citywide leader, took that spark and turned it into movement. Policies were reviewed, training protocols restructured. Voices long silenced were finally heard in courtrooms, boardrooms, and town halls. The story wasn't just about one man sitting in a park. It was about who gets to take up space, who gets to feel safe, who gets to belong. And that brings us to the lesson. The world doesn't change when heroes rise in capes. It changes when ordinary people refuse to look away, when someone decides to press record, when a lawyer decides to act, even if the odds seem stacked, when an officer chooses conscience over comfort, and when a man like Henry Lawson, tired and unbending, decides to stay seated because he's already spent a lifetime standing up. In your own life, you may not face a spotlight moment like this, but you will face choices to speak up or stay quiet to protect your peace or protect the truth. This story reminds us that justice is not the responsibility of one, it is the burden and privilege of all. So the next time you see something wrong, ask yourself, what would I do? Because change doesn't begin in courtrooms or press conferences. It begins in parks, on sidewalks, in everyday acts of resistance and courage. If this story moved you, if it made you feel, reflect, or see things differently, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment about how this story touched you. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter. Stories that shine a light where others have looked away. Because we're not just telling stories, we're building something. One voice at a time. One truth at a time. And we need you with us.